Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, I am going to attempt to do a little bit of a recap of a workshop that myself and one of my longtime teachers, mentors, colleagues, friends, Astrid Sherman, and I presented at the IADMS Conference in Las Vegas in September. So anytime you go to these conferences, you absolutely cannot attend every event or every session. There's always like 5 or 6 sessions happening at one time. So it's impossible to attend them all. And there were people who were not able to attend our workshop who afterwards were like, hey, is there any way we can find out more information about this topic? And asking just, for kind of a synopsis of the workshop, if you will. And so I thought I would attempt to do a little recap of it as a podcast episode. The caveat with this is that it was a workshop. There was demonstrations of like assessment and exercises and stuff. I will do my best to convey that through an audio medium, but I may end up needing to do some social media posts with little demonstrations of the exercises and stuff. So I will do my best, but just know that this was a longer format. It was an hour-long workshop, and also it had sort of a practical component to it. So our topic at IADMS was clenching, gripping, and knuckling, what your dancer's feet can tell you. And when Astrid and I started to kind of brainstorm and think about what it was that we wanted to present on at IADMS, we were tossing around a bunch of different ideas. We have presented together many times in the past, and we really were trying to think of something that would be impactful for a large proportion of the people who are there. And it's a really varied audience. It's dance teachers, it's dancers, it's healthcare providers, and healthcare providers from all different backgrounds. Like there's physios and chiros and osteopath and podiatrists and nutrition and all, like literally everything. So we were trying to think of like what would be a really great topic for this. And we know that the majority or a majority of injuries in dancers occur in the foot and ankles. And depending on what literature you're looking at, it can be more than 50%. A lot of times we look at that breakdown and it's, kind of 30-ish percent, 31% of injuries are ankle injuries and another 26% are foot injuries. So together we're looking at more than 50% of injuries being foot and ankle injuries. So we know that that's a really important topic to be addressing in terms of injury prevention or risk reduction and those types of things. And we also know, again, just from the literature and from research, that more than or around 75% of dance injuries are what we would classify as overuse or chronic injuries. And oftentimes, those injuries result from improper mechanics, or sometimes it's deemed like poor technique, but it's often just like mechanically how somebody is utilizing their body and working through their body can lead to some of these overuse or overloading type injuries. So we were starting to think about that and, okay, what could we address when it comes to foot and ankle stuff? And Astrid was like, well, I think we should really look into the dancers who like grip or clench or curl their toes, because one of the things that's incredible about presenting with Astrid, that I feel really fortunate that we've gotten to do this so many times, is we have very different perspectives in terms of how we're looking at I'm going to use the word problem, but how we're looking at an issue that's coming up in the dance world. And obviously being a healthcare provider and being a physiotherapist, I'm coming at it from a very biomechanical perspective and an often like an injury perspective. Like, okay, what are we looking at? Why is this problematic for injuries and all of those types of things? And Astrid, being a ballet teacher, is really coming at it from a much more aesthetic perspective. Like, why do I care about this as a teacher in terms of how it impacts my dancers' ability to perform their craft and their artistry and all of those types of things? And I think that this, like, really complements, like the two approaches really complement each other super nicely. And we actually got a lot of feedback after the session from people who said that that was what they really liked about the workshop, was that we were addressing both of those aspects of it. So we know that feet are complex structurally, for sure, in terms of, they've got 26 different bones and 33 different joints and dozens of ligaments and hundreds of connections and things like that. So we know that feet are really complex when it comes to just like a structural perspective. But feet are also, for dancers, like really, really foundational and instrumental in how that dancer is interacting with their environment. And so generally, for most styles of dance, our feet are the way, they are our contact to the ground. They are the way that we interact with our surface and our surroundings. And because of that, our feet can actually tell us a lot about what else is potentially going on in the body. And so when we have dancers or see dancers who maybe have things going on in their feet, it may give us a clue as to other things that might be happening. And an example of this is potentially a dancer who, let's say, is hypermobile and maybe is using their feet and might be using some of these gripping or clenching or curling strategies to try and create a little bit more stability in their body. We could have a dancer who maybe struggles with proprioception and balance, and therefore, same thing, they are using their feet as a way of trying to increase that proprioception. So our feet can tell us a lot about a dancer and a lot about how a dancer interacts with their environment, which is, again, why we thought this was a really great topic for us to try and address in our workshop. So what are we talking about when we use all of these different words? And you will hear all of these words used mostly interchangeably within the dance world. And maybe some people are even using different words. We tended to use the words curling, clenching, gripping, knuckling. I know there are others as well, so you can insert whatever word you want to into this. But essentially what we are talking about is flexion that is happening at the interphalangeal joint. So in the toes, at the proximal, so PIP, proximal interphalangeal joint, and the DIP, the distal interphalangeal joint. When we talk about clenching or curling, we're generally seeing flexion happening at both of those joints. And usually we're going to notice that the most when a dancer is like pointing their foot. So if that foot is like, whether it's like a tendu or something, so their foot's on the floor, or if they're bringing their foot up off the floor into a retire or something, we're going to notice that curling. When we talk about gripping, we may see flexion at both of those joints, depending on the structure of the foot and the strategy that that dancer is using. But it is also really common, especially if dancers have a lot of hypermobility in their toe joints, that we may see flexion at the PIP joint, but we may actually see extension happening at the DIP joint. And that's just, again, if they are more mobile in their foot, they have the ability to use these different strategies. It is the same mechanism of what is happening, just because their foot is in weight bearing with them standing, we may actually see a slightly different pattern of where we see that flexion and extension. Mechanically, it is generally related to the same kind of underlying causes in through there. And then we also threw in this term knuckling because you hear it a lot specifically in the ballet world. And this is that same idea, but it would be when a dancer is in a point shoe. So if they're on point, but they're still trying to use that same strategy of flexing through the IP joints, then sometimes we'll end up calling that knuckling. And it's a very specific movement pattern that you can kind of like, not that you can see through the point shoe, but when a dancer is doing this, you can kind of tell they're doing it with the way they're not like quite up over their block, and sometimes it will affect their ankle positioning as well. And so you can kind of see that that's what a dancer is doing. So like I said, we use a whole bunch of these terms interchangeably, but what we are essentially talking about is this strategy of kind of curling or overusing those toe flexor muscles. I guess one thing we should also add into this is the anatomy from a muscular perspective of what is actually happening there. And so one of the reasons we see this, like I said, it can be related to people, trying to increase proprioception or increase stability in cases of hypermobility and stuff. But really what it comes down to is dancers who are fundamentally using their extrinsic foot muscles. And I'll talk about this more in a second. And also, just as an aside, there is a podcast episode. I don't have the episode number off the top of my head, but I will link it in the show notes that we looked at foot form versus function and talked a little bit about the intrinsic versus extrinsic muscles. But essentially, when we have these dancers who are doing this kind of curling or gripping with their toes, they are becoming over-reliant on or predominantly using these extrinsic foot muscles and are likely not as active in their intrinsic foot muscles. So the difference between those two groups of muscles, extrinsic muscles are muscles that start externally to the foot. So these are muscles that generally come from our deep calf area, so below our gastrocnemius and soleus muscles, which are our big calf muscles. They come from the deep calf muscle or the deep calf area. And then the tendons of these muscles go into the foot, and in this case, specifically go to the ends of the toes. So they are toe flexor tendons, but the muscles themselves originate in the calf area. We also, in our feet, have intrinsic foot muscles. So these are muscles that are in our feet, so intrinsic in the feet, and they start and end in the foot. So they don't cross the ankle joint. They are local, more specific to the foot. And those intrinsic muscles are really important from a stabilization perspective. They're really important from a shock absorbing perspective and just being able to maintain the structure and function of the foot. And what we often see in dancers is there is a little bit of an imbalance between these, where dancers are really, really, really using their extrinsic muscles and not necessarily using their intrinsic muscles as much as they could or should be. And that will often show up as this curling or gripping through the toes. So, why do we care? From a physiotherapist perspective, I care because we see a lot of injuries that are related to this. And so if we have this imbalance that is happening between the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles, we're seeing this curling in the toes, we will often see injuries associated. And so posterior ankle impingement is a really common one, especially the soft tissue types of impingement in through there. We'll see overuse of some of those extrinsic foot muscles. So the flexor hallucis longus in particular, we'll see tendinopathies or just chronic injuries develop with that because dancers are becoming a little bit over-reliant on it. We see all sorts of things. Sometimes there's some links to plantar fasciitis and other types of injuries as well. So I am interested in it definitely from an injury, risk reduction perspective, and also just from a mechanical perspective. Like I said, those intrinsic muscles are really important for kind of shock absorbing and how our feet actually function to help us interact with our environment and to interact with the floor. And so if those are not working optimally, that's going to affect our mechanics, not only of our feet, but higher up the chain as well. It's going to affect the mechanics of our ankles and our knees and our hips and other things. And so I'm really interested in it from that perspective. From a more dance teaching perspective, I know Astrid was much more interested in this curling or gripping from an aesthetic perspective. And so in dance and especially in ballet, there's this idea of our lines, and we want to finish our lines, and we want there to be energy through our lines, and our feet are no exception to that. So the feet are the continuation of the lower extremity line. And when we have curling that happens, and I'm sure you're all familiar with seeing some of those dancers who have that kind of curl at the end of their toes, it's almost in a really abrupt break or end to that line versus a dancer who can utilize their intrinsic foot muscles more and think about lengthening through their toes. You get that extension of the energy going all the way to the end of the foot and then actually extending beyond the end of the foot. So from just an aesthetic perspective and the completion of these energy lines, it makes a really big difference to what we actually visually see when a dancer is kind of curling versus being able to really work the foot in a little bit more of an efficient manner. The other kind of point that Astrid brought up that I thought was interesting as well, and certainly holds true to what we see clinically, is a lot of the times these dancers, and it's not such an aesthetic thing necessarily, but it just tells you a bit maybe about your dancers. And the dancers who tend to be the ones who kind of curl are often the dancers who are really like trying to give 120% at all times. And so they're trying so hard that they're literally engaging every muscle in their body to its maximum degree. And then they habitually develop this, habit of curling through the toes again when they're pointing their foot or kind of gripping on the floor as well sometimes. And so in some cases, it may not actually be that there's like mechanically anything going on that needs to be addressed, but it may be that we need to spend time with that dancer talking about efficiency of movement, or really looking at, okay, how can we allow certain areas of the body to, I don't want to say relax, because we want the intrinsics to be active, but not be working that 110% at all times so that they're literally just like gripping or activating every single muscle in their body. So sometimes it's more of even like almost a personality trait. These are your dancers that kind of like type A, give, and we're really, really trying their hardest. Sometimes we actually need to work with them to like pull back a little bit and say, hey, can we be more efficient about this movement pattern and not just be working so hard all the time? So again, I think it's interesting to have those different perspectives about like why from a healthcare professional perspective do we care about this kind of gripping and curling versus from a dance teaching perspective, why do we care? So how do we know if we have dancers who are doing this? Number one thing, and especially if you were a dance teacher, but even if you're a healthcare provider, whoever you are, you need to look at your dancers without anything on their feet. So no shoes, no socks, just completely bare feet. And especially in certain styles of dance where shoes are the norm, so ballet, for instance, we don't generally participate in ballet in bare feet. We're usually in a soft ballet shoe or a pointe shoe. It's really important for teachers to periodically get their dancers to take their shoes off and watch them dance in bare feet and see what those feet are doing, because our shoes can hide all sorts of things. And especially when we're thinking about just this curling in the toes, we don't necessarily notice that with a shoe on, because if their ankle is pointed and the rest of their foot is pointed, it's kind of hard sometimes to tell exactly what the tips of their toes are doing if they have a shoe on. So number one thing is it's really important to look at your dancers with nothing on their feet. Again, in other forms and styles and contemporary and stuff, it's so common for dancers nowadays to be dancing in socks all the time that, again, although they don't have shoes on, you may not actually be looking at them in bare feet and you might not know what their toes are doing. So have your dancer take their shoes off, look at them in bare feet periodically. Signs of things we might see that we, are looking for. If we have our dancer just standing, relaxed, in parallel, let's say, is there evidence or are you seeing any evidence of kind of blisters or callousing or anything like that along, especially like the knuckles along the toes? That is often a really hallmark sign that when that person has shoes on, they are gripping or curling their toes. And so they're getting that rubbing or that friction. And so we will often, like very, very often, see those calluses that have developed in that area. If they're younger dancers and maybe they haven't been dancing for quite as long, you might not see it yet, but you're certainly looking for evidence of kind of blisters or callousing or things like that. In standing, you're also looking at what are their feet doing? Can they stand with their toes completely relaxed? Or when they're just standing, in quiet standing with their feet in parallel, Are they gripping their toes? Are their toes curling? Is there flexion happening at the PIP joint? What is happening when they're in standing? Are there any deformities in their toes? Sometimes you'll see dancers who've developed like hammer toes or things like that from that habitual gripping that's been happening. So what are you seeing in terms of the dancer just standing in quiet standing? Because we should all be able to just stand with our feet in parallel, weight distributed evenly between our feet, and have our toes be very, very relaxed. They should not necessarily have to be active in an activity like that. Then we're generally going to take people through a series of movements. And this is what we did in the workshop. That was like kind of the more practical component that's a little bit harder over a podcast interface. But looking at things like going into a knee bend in parallel or in turnout, going into a demi-plie, and having your dancer do these movements and seeing what happens to their feet once they start to move, once they have to shift their center of gravity, once they have to stabilize more. Are they then starting to grip or go into these clenching or gripping patterns? I always will look at dancers in standing. I will always look at a knee bend of some sort, whether that be a parallel plie, a plie in first position, whatever it happens to be. And then I'm always going to look at a dancer going up on rise or releve as well. And again, depending on the style that they dance, maybe it's going to be in parallel, maybe it's going to be in first position. More often than not, it's in both. And again, we're looking for all of that evidence of what is happening with their toes as they are doing these movements. The other thing that's really important to look at is what's happening to their foot when they point their foot when they are not weight bearing. And so I usually do this in sitting, like in long sitting. So have them sit on the floor and, just have them point their feet in front of them and see what happens and see where that movement is initiating from. What is the ankle doing? What are the toes doing? Are they able to lengthen through the toes or are they really curling in through their toes? You may, depending on the dancer and again, what it's important for them, you might actually look at that more in like a retire type position or something where they're pointing their foot, but they're not necessarily sitting on the floor. So it doesn't have to be in that position. I just tend to look at it in that position because it's usually easy for me. One of the things that came up in the workshop that I think is worth noting is, especially in that long sitting position, that's often one of the first positions that kids are taught to point their feet is, in baby ballet or whatever, and people who start dancing when they're really little, is like the exercises, which was like the good toes, naughty toes, and like all of that type of terminology with flexing and pointing the feet. And I think that we want to be really careful of the language that we use, especially when we're thinking about developing like the movement patterns and the musculature in the foot. What we often see is, especially with little kids, we talk about good toes and naughty toes, and I don't think body parts need to be bad, and so maybe we can change that language. But we also often will talk about pointing your toes. And that, especially with younger kids, is almost always the first way that they're taught to point their foot, is point your toes. And that potentially is contributing or can contribute to some of these dancers who develop this habit of curling their toes because they've been told to point their toes as opposed to point your foot or, point your whatever terminology you want to, like some teachers will say like lengthen your feet or lengthen your toes or stretch through your toes and other language that might not promote that curling so much. Personally, I tend to use point your feet. And so we're thinking of the foot as like a larger, like we're not just focusing on the toes, we're thinking of the whole foot. And then in the clinic, I'm often actually like isolating that even more because we will look at dancers' ability to point their ankle without pointing their toes. So to actually keep their toes extended back and point their ankle down. And so sometimes I'm getting really specific about the terminology that I'm using. But if you're a dance teacher, and especially if you're teaching really little dancers, really trying to take the focus away from our toes and think more about like globally our whole foot, I think is very helpful in terms of preventing some of these habitual things that might develop with dancers who are really trying to, quote unquote, point their toes and then end up just curling or clenching their toes as opposed to being able to really lengthen through the toes and point through their whole foot. The other thing that's worth noting here as well is those dancers, especially in that long sitting position, so feet out in front of you if you're sitting on the floor, the dancers who really curl and clench through their toes when they're doing that oftentimes are going to be creating limitation at the ankle joint. So because these extrinsic muscles cross the ankle joint and cross into the foot and control the toes, if we have that muscle maximally activating in the toes because they're curling their toes, it's actually not going to be able to allow the ankle to fully point in that position. And I'm sure all of you, especially if you're a teacher, know exactly what I'm talking about, that like the dancers who curl their toes down, but then their ankle kind of like pulls back a little bit. And again, it's the same pattern we see with knuckling when they're in point shoes, where they're not quite over their block because they're pulling back because their toes are curling. We want them to be able to think about fully pointing through the ankle, or plantar flexing through the ankle, if you will, and then just think about the length through the toes as opposed to it being a movement that's initiated at the ends of those tendons with the toes curling first, and then we lose some of that movement available at the ankle. It's an idea that's called active insufficiency. I'm not going to get into like the nitty gritty of it, but all of you, especially teachers, will know exactly like what I'm talking about in terms of that movement. So if you have dancers who you've really been struggling with like their line through their ankle especially, and you're like, ooh, I just don't know if they have like good joint mobility through their ankle, take a look at their toes, because if they are curling their toes, that is probably contributing to maybe some limitations in ankle mobility. So those are some of the things that we're looking for. So you want to look at them in bare feet, in standing, in different weight-bearing positions, whether that be plie, rise, and then also making sure we're really looking at how they're working through their foot and how they're pointing their foot in non-weight-bearing positions as well. In terms of how we address this, it really comes down a little bit to like the individual dancer, because like I said, in some cases, it really is more of like a habit than anything. So in some dancers, simply educating them about it and making them aware that that is what they are doing, they can actually start to break that habit, and they can start to work differently through their foot and really start to just change their movement patterns. And it may be as simple as that. In a lot of dancers, though, if this has been going on for a long time or there's more mechanical reasons why it's happening, it may require a little bit more intervention in terms of potentially having to work on the length of those tendons. What we see really commonly is if a dancer has worked this way for a long time, they actually start to get shortening that happens in those tendons that go into the toes. And so not only are they habitually overusing those, but because of that, they're getting tight, they lose a little bit of length, so it makes it even harder for them to actually keep their toes long. So we may be looking at doing kind of myofascial release type stuff. We might need to be doing like tendon lengthening, kind of like stretches and things like that to really focus on getting back some of that passive length in the tendons in order for them to even be able to access the new movement patterns that we want them to be able to with keeping their toes long. Generally, we are working a lot on intrinsic foot muscle control. So like I said, this pattern seems to develop because of a little bit of an imbalance between the extrinsics and the intrinsics. And so one thing we often need to do is start to work on building up the strength and control through those intrinsic foot muscles so that they can actually do some of that work and we don't over-rely on those extrinsic muscles. And then we definitely need to look further up the chain as well. So like I said, a lot of the times when we see these strategies happening in dancers, it could be because they're trying to use their feet to compensate for something else that's going on in their body. So this could be, like we mentioned, hypermobility. It could just be a lack of control or strength through the lumbopelvic region. It could be deficits in proprioception and struggles with balance or anything like that. And so we want to really look at and address those things as well, because we can absolutely address things that are happening locally at the foot, but if they are happening because a dancer isn't able to stabilize really well through, say, their core or through their hip on a particular side, they are going to continue to happen. And so anytime we're dealing with foot stuff, it's really important that we think about the whole integration of the entire body and the entire kinetic chain. And then we may need to integrate some of those things. So say we're like, okay, we're working on single leg stability. We're going to then integrate some of that foot control, foot intrinsics, really working on having a stable base with other things that challenge that single leg stability and work on improving that single leg stability or whatever the issue is. So with foot stuff, I think it's really important. I mean, we always want to be looking at the whole body, but especially with foot stuff, we really need to be looking at what's happening higher up the chain and making sure that we're doing exercises that kind of encompass all of that and integrate all of those aspects, because we can't just treat the foot in isolation without looking at how it interacts with the rest of the body. And then in the workshop, we also talked a bit about some like kind of what I call like a functional integration. So not just looking up the chain, but then also looking into how does this translate into dance specific things. So making sure that we are training and including movement patterns that they're doing in dance in class. So we, talked about like a tendu or a flick flack, if you know what that is, kind of like that, like peeling the foot off the floor and working through that, but with the intrinsic activation and really working on the lengthening through those interphalangeal joints with movements that they are going to be doing in class or in the studio. So we can't forget that part of it, because we can do 7 million exercises in the clinic and people can get really good and really efficient with them. But if we don't work on that integration or like connecting it to what they're doing functionally with dance type movements, as soon as they go back into the studio, they may go back into their old habits. And so they may say, okay, this is the exercise I do in physio and look how beautifully I do it and I can control this and whatever. And then they go to class and they do a tendu, but they do it the old way. They do it the way that's like reinforcing those movement patterns that we're trying to move away from. So we need to make sure that we're looking at the integration into their dance specific movements as well. And mostly foundational movements, things like a tendu. Those are where we're going to build up those new movement patterns so that we can change how they're training in class. We don't need to go through every complex move they've ever done in dance. We need to look at the basics of how are they using the floor, how are they activating the foot with basic things like a flick flack or a tendu or things like that. So, like I said, this made probably more sense as a workshop because we actually got a chance to show all those assessment things and show the exercises that we use and go through things a little bit more practically. I will do my best to try and put something together from like a social media perspective or maybe even a blog post or something. I'll figure out what makes the most sense so that I can do a few like video demonstrations for you. So keep an eye out on, especially social media, on Instagram in particular. You can follow me at Dance Physio Erika, to try and give you guys a better idea of some of the practical parts. But hopefully that was helpful anyway, just in terms of a little bit of like mechanically what is going on and why we care, and that integration between sort of the more clinical lens and the more aesthetic dance teacher lens, because I think that's where a lot of the value lies in some of these presentations and some of these workshops that we got to participate in at IADMS in particular this time, but at any conference, is really having those diverse perspectives. So we're all aiming for the same outcome in terms of what we want our dancers to be able to achieve, but we're probably coming at it from slightly different lenses. And I think there's, a lot of beauty and a lot of power in being able to combine those perspectives. So I hope that you found that helpful. If you were at our session at IADMS, I really appreciate you being there. We had a great turnout. We had like a lot of great participation from people. So thank you so much if you were there. If you were not there and any of this was not clear and you have any questions or want clarification on anything, please feel free to reach out. I love foot and ankle stuff. I love talking about it. I love teaching about it. So I am more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. And as always, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to further your knowledge and be part of this community. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.